Jinzo is one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most iconic old-school monsters. Throughout the years, Jinzo has gotten more than 15 different prints in 7 different rarities. Pretty much everyone that played back in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh remembers facing against a Jinzo, or perhaps they even owned their own copy to defeat their opponents with. Jinzo was limited pretty much on release back in October of 2002, and it remained limited until September of 2007, where it was semi-limited for one format before switching to unlimited, which is where it's been ever since. This card not only made an impact on the TCG format by being a very powerful level 6 monster that saw tons of play, but also it made an impact because it had a bunch of retrains throughout the years. In today's video, I want to go over what made Jinzo so powerful back in the day, and also I want to talk about the support it received throughout the years. If you enjoyed today's video, I just want to let you guys know that I've done a few of these in the past. I used to call them the Yu-Gi-Oh! Icon series, so we have a video on Summoned Skull, Blackluster Soldier, and Barrel Dragon. This one though is all about Jinzo. Jinzo was released in Pharaoh's Servant back in 2002 as a secret rare, and it was one of the biggest cards out of that set. It's a level 6 Dark Machine effect monster with 2400 attack and 1500 defense, and the current text on the card says trap cards and their effects on the field cannot be activated and negate all trap effects on the field. Basically, Jinzo really does not like trap cards. Why was Jinzo so popular back in the day? Well, for starters, 2400 attack points on a level 6 monster was pretty good, especially when it also has a great ability. Back in the day, trap cards were the main way to interact with the opponent on their turn. You didn't have a lot of hand traps. I mean, sure, you had Karibo, but nothing like we have right now, and you didn't really have a lot of quick effects on monster cards, so trap cards were the main way to stop your opponent on their turn. Cards like Sakuratsu Armor and Mere Force and Torrential Tribute and Trap Hole and Bottomless Trap Hole and so many others were all very common cards in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And Jinzo shut all of those cards down. Don't get me wrong, there were great quick play spells back then too, things like Book of Moon, MST, and Scapegoat for example, but the majority of back row cards that your opponent would have, especially in the early years of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, were going to be trap cards, and Jinzo was a great counter to those cards. Now, what made Jinzo so interesting and made it kind of a skill testing card is that it is a symmetrical effect. Yes, you lock your opponent out of their trap cards and their trap card effects, but also you lock yourself out of your own trap cards, which meant that while Jinzo was a great way to push through your opponent's back row, it oftentimes could also leave you pretty defenseless. And while Jinzo was limited, keep in mind you had plenty of ways to get it back on the board if your opponent managed to get rid of it. Things like Monster Reborn and Premature Burial, for example, but also cards like Call of the Haunted. Now, every time I mention Call of the Haunted and Jinzo, I get people asking about that interaction. Basically, Call of the Haunted brings the Jinzo back, and then the Jinzo negates the Call of the Haunted. And while you might think that Jinzo then goes to the graveyard, that's actually not the case, and if your opponent was able to MST the Call of the Haunted after the Jinzo was on the board, the Jinzo would stick around. So Call of the Haunted on Jinzo was a great combo back in the day. Jinzo was a great card for many years, but also it got a ton of retrains. Let's talk about a few of those. One of the weirder examples of a Jinzo card was Jinzo number 7, released in Metal Raiders in early 2002. Now you might be asking yourself, wait a second here, Jinzo was released in Pharaoh's Servant, which was after Metal Raiders. Why was Jinzo number 7 released first? That doesn't really make any sense. Also, where are Jinzo 2 through 6? I mean, who really knows? Basically, what happened was that Jinzo number 7 in the OCG, if you translate its name, just means Android 7, and the Jinzo that we now know, that card was called Android Psycho Shocker. Fun fact, by the way, that's where the name Team APS comes from, Android Psycho Shocker. I don't know if you guys knew that, but now you do. So Jinzo number 7 does technically in the TCG have Jinzo in its name, but the card is pretty terrible and it really has no relation to the Jinzo archetype. A few years later, in 2004, we got Amplifier out of Ancient Sanctuary. This was an equip spell for Jinzo, and it says, equip only to Jinzo. This card's activation and effect cannot be negated. The equipped monster's effect, trap cards, and and their effects on the field cannot be activated. Negate all trap effects on the field becomes your opponent cannot activate trap cards or their effects on the field. Negate all trap effects your opponent controls. When this card leaves the field, destroy the equipped monster. So basically it turned Jinzo's symmetrical effect into a one-sided effect, which could be pretty appealing, but realistically this card was not very good. Maybe if it would have given Jinzo some extra attack points, that would have been pretty cool, but most people that were using Jinzo knew how to play around its own drawback, so people would set cards like Book of Moon to have a piece of defense even while they had the Jinzo on the board. Basically, don't summon Jinzo if you have no other way of defending yourself. You don't want to summon a Jinzo when you have like 5 trap cards set. So Amplifier was pretty inconsistent and most people chose not to play it. Then in 2008, out of Light of Destruction, we got a few new Jinzo cards, Jinzo Returner and Jinzo Lord. Basically, if you remember back to that ban list timeline I talked about earlier, at this point Jinzo was unlimited because the last time it was limited or semi-limited was back in 2007. Even by 2008 standards, Jinzo Lord was pretty unimpressive. This card requires you to send a Jinzo you control to the graveyard to special summon it from the hand, and then it has the exact same Jinzo negation effect, but also you can destroy as many face-up traps on the field as possible, and if you do, you inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card destroyed. It also only had 200 more attack points, which doesn't really make a big difference, and while destroying trap cards is pretty interesting, I guess, it doesn't really matter because you were already locking them down anyway with the Jinzo ability. Jinzo Returner, on the other hand, now this was a great card. When Jinzo Returner is sent to the graveyard, you can target one Jinzo in your graveyard, special summon it, but destroy it during your end phase. Also, Jinzo Returner can attack directly, but realistically you don't really want to summon this card, you only want to send it to the graveyard. And back in 2008, we had the original effect on Future Fusion, so you could use Future Fusion revealing Chimera Tech Overdragon to send 3 copies of Jinzo Returner and 3 copies of Jinzo to the graveyard alongside a bunch of other machine type monsters. Then all 3 returners would trigger to special summon all 3 Jinzos, and you would not only have a lot of damage on the board, but also you would lock both players out of their trap cards, which would stop your opponent's defensive cards like Torrential Tribute or Mere Force. So that was a pretty great combo. Not quite meta, Yu-Gi-Oh was pretty crazy back in 2008, but it was certainly a rogue option if you wanted to try to OTK the opponent. Jinzo was still good, but it did fall out of popularity over the next few years, but in 2011 we did get Psychic Shockwave out of Extreme Victory, which was a new piece of Jinzo support. Psychic Shockwave is a normal trap card that says, when your opponent activates a trap card, discard 1 spell or trap, special summon 1 level 6 Dark Machine monster from your deck. Now while you can summon other things besides Jinzo, I think the best case for this card is to summon a Jinzo to then negate the trap card that your opponent just used, and that is a pretty decent combo. Despite on paper looking pretty good, Psychic Shockwave unfortunately was not quite good enough to make Jinzo a great card at competitive events once again. It's not the worst card in the world. I think it should allow you to discard any type of card, not only spells or traps, but hey, at least it was a new piece of support. In 2015, we got Jinzo Jector out of Secrets of Eternity. This card is actually pretty good. It adds a Jinzo monster to your hand, and then it reveals all of your opponent's back row, and if they have at least 1 trap, you get to special summon Jinzo from your hand. So I like Jinzo Jector. No, it was not enough to make Jinzo good at the time, but it is a card that is pretty good in the modern Jinzo deck. Then, for a while, not only did competitive players kind of move away from using Jinzo at all, but also Konami stopped printing support for the card. Then, in the second half of 2020 though, we got a ton of Jinzo support. In Battles of Legend Armageddon, for example, which released in July of 2020, we got Psychic Wave, a new Jinzo quick play spell card. Not the best card I've ever seen, but it was at least Jinzo support. A few months later, in Dragons of Legend the Complete Series, we got Jinzo Layered, a new rank 6 Jinzo support card. It's pretty good. It's not insane, of course, but it is a pretty good piece of Jinzo support, and it makes sense in the context of the rest of the archetype. And finally, just 2 weeks after Jinzo layered, we got a ton of Jinzo support in Legendary Duelist Rage of Ra. Cards like Cyber Energy Shock and Jinzo the Machine Menace were great new cards that really modernized the Jinzo deck. Psychic Mega Cyber and Psychic Bounder were great cards too. They weren't enough to make Jinzo a competitive card once again, but they were pretty cool, and I think 2020 was a really great year for fans of Jinzo. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.